Hello my dear friends and welcome to StudyIQ. I am Joy and today in this lecture we will discuss about the revenue shortfall under the GST or the Goods and Services Tax. First of all, let us understand what is the current affair. The revenue collections from the GST, that is Goods and Services Tax, is still below the target set by the government under the 2018 budget. So this is the current affair, and based on this we will analyze this issue in detail in this lecture. Now let us understand how does the GST collections fare thus far, or what is the present status of GST collections. In the budget 2018, the government had set the GST revenue target for the financial year 2018-19 at 12 lakh crore. So this was in the Union Budget of 2018. So, an annual target of 12 lakh crore means that a monthly average of 1.07 lakh crore. And a total collection by the government between May to October 2018 is 5.75 lakh crore. So, this will average to 95,870 crore. So this is the average. But when we compare this with the average, the revenue collections from the GST in the month of December and November. So consecutively for 2 months, December and November, the revenue collections from the GST declined, and this is a signal that GST collections are declining. And along with this under collection in the GST Council has so far taken more than 190 items out of the highest tax slab, that is 28%. So, around 190 items were taken from this 28%, that is the highest tax slab, and they were put into lower tax slabs. So, this is also one factor that can lead to further reduction in the collections under GST. And furthermore, the GST Council is also considering a relaxation in the GST norms for MSMEs or micro, small and medium entrepreneurs. So, this is also another major concern that this will reduce the collections under the GST. And also another proposal by the GST Council is that the annual sales threshold will increase. That means now at present the annual sales threshold is 20 lakhs. That means compulsory GST registration is mandatory from those enterprises which have an annual sale of more than 20 lakhs. Now this threshold is proposed to be increased to 50 lakhs. So this will again lead to under collection, because now there are more entrepreneurs or enterprises that are covered under the GST net. Now if this threshold is increased to 50 lakhs, there will be lesser enterprises that will be covered under the GST regime. So lesser number means lesser tax base, and lesser tax base means lesser tax collection. So this is also another concern that will lead to further reduction in the collections under the GST. So such type of relaxations like relaxations provided to MSMEs or increasing the threshold etc. will further reduce the tax revenue for the government from the GST or the Goods and Services Tax. And furthermore, even the other possible revenue alternatives for the government, including the direct taxes or the disinvestment receipts, these are not enough in order to compensate the GST shortfall. So this indicates that there will be a serious revenue deficit or revenue shortfall for the government. So other major sources for the government is direct taxation or income from disinvestment or the receipts from disinvestment. Even such receipts or such revenue for the government will not compensate the loss incurred by the government from GST or under collection by GST. So this is a major cause of concern. Why this becomes a major concern? Because the overall revenue of the government will come down, and when the government revenue is less than government expenditure, we call it as fiscal deficit. So what happens when the revenue of the government decreases and expenditure increases? The fiscal deficit widens. So we have seen that now GST being a major source of revenue for the government, there is under collection or lesser collection under GST. So revenue has decreased, and since 2019 is the election year or the upcoming Lok Sabha elections, And considering various other factors, government has announced various schemes, programs, projects, etc. The expenditure of the government is likely to increase. So this points to the fact that fiscal deficit can widen. So fiscal deficit widens and government will not be able to meet the fiscal consolidation target of the government. So as a result, what happens? Borrowings will increase. In order to meet the increased expenditure, government will borrow money. So this will lead to higher borrowings, and this will lead to higher interest payment obligations for the government. So higher interest payment obligations will also impact the value of rupee. So these are all consequences of lesser revenue collection and higher expenditure leading to fiscal deficit or widening of the fiscal deficit of the government. Now let us also understand other major concerns associated with. The first one is that the state's revenue collections under the GST regimes have been uneven. The state's GST or SGST is not uniform, and the GST Council is examining the interstate variations. So there are interstate variations. That means some states would be receiving more revenue from GST, some states would be receiving lesser revenue. So there is an interstate variation or disparity in revenue collections from the GST regime. But what is the problem here? Under the GST, the central government is bound to compensate states for the revenue shortfalls for the first 5 years of the GST regime. So a provision has been made such that if any state incur any loss due to GST or rolling out of GST, the central government is bound to compensate such states for the initial 5 years after the implementation of GST. And we see that different states receive different portion or different proportion of revenue under the GST regime. So as a result of this compensation provision, what happens? The central government will have to incur additional expenditure in order to compensate the states for the revenue losses under the GST regime. So central government has got two options. First option is that government should drop the fiscal deficit target or the goals. The central government has set up a target of 3.3% of GDP under the fiscal consolidation or fiscal deficit target. So either government should drop this or the government should reduce the capital expenditure. So these are the two options available with the central government. Now there is a serious under collection under the GST regime, and there is a revenue shortfall under GST. So GST revenues are not even meeting the targets. So it is impossible for the center to compensate the states from the GST revenue. So the option left out with the central government or with the union government is to do away with the fiscal deficit target or to reduce the capital expenditure. Both these alternatives have its own consequences. The first one, if government do away with the fiscal deficit target, it will lead to widening of fiscal deficit, leading to higher borrowings, and which we have discussed, it has lots of consequences. Secondly, if government reduce the capital expenditure, the gross capital formation or the investment in the economy will come down, and it is also a phase where the private investment have already come down. So government has to make in capital expenditure or investment in order to fill the gap of lack of private investment. So in this situation, if government cuts down the capital expenditure, it will impact the gross capital formation of the country, and which will lead to lesser investments, which will lead to lesser productivity, which will lead to lesser GDP and lesser economic growth. So this will have a serious consequence on the economic growth of the country. So government has to make a choice from these alternatives, and both these alternatives have got its own consequences. Now secondly, another cause of concern is that higher compliance of the taxpayers did not necessarily translate into higher collections. For example, the revenue collections of GST in the month of November 2018 was less, or it fell compared to the previous months. But in the month of November 2018, the total number of returns filed were more than the previous month. So in October 2018, the number of returns filed were lesser than November 2018. But in October 2018, the collections or GST revenue collection under GST regime was higher. So it indicates that even though the number of returns filed increases, it does not really make an impact in the collection. So we cannot derive a real direct relationship between returns filed and collections. And GST collections are inevitable for a consumption-led investment. So what is meant by consumption-led investment? Consumption-led investment means that the consumption or aggregate demand in the economy is higher. So with increased aggregate demand, in order to meet the increased demand, the supply will increase. Therefore, there will be more investment. That is consumption-led investment. And it is when the aggregate demand increases, it is one important factor which will lead to economic growth of a country. So when aggregate demand increases, supply will increase. That means output will increase. So when output increases, the GDP also increases, which will lead to economic growth. So there is a direct relationship between consumption and GDP. So in order to achieve the 8% GDP target, the consumption has to increase. And when consumption increases, the GDP collection also would increase. So if there is a deficit or shortfall in the GDP collection, it means that the consumption is also not as expected. So these are the major concerns with regard to a shortfall in the revenue collections under the GST regime or the goods and services regime. You can find the PDF of this lecture on my Facebook page, and for any queries regarding your UPSC preparations, you can get in touch with me on my Facebook page, or you can email me at joycey.studyiq@gmail.com. Thank you.